Hello everyone. In the last episode, we saw how Martin Ocelot was banished from Mexica society for his religious beliefs. Now the thing to note about Martin's case is that his banishment reflects a general exorcism of Mexica culture. Now, exorcism has a long tradition in the West. Exorcism has numerous definitions that depend on the time period and culture we are talking about. But in today's episode, we are going to go with exorcism as casting out malevolent forces, in this case, demons. The idea of exorcism as casting out malevolent forces extends all the way back to the 4th century. Keep in mind that although Christianity eventually becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, in its early days, Christians and Christianity were seen as a weird cult. The Christian author Lactantius believed that the persecution of Christians in the early days of the church was not done by evil men, it was done by men possessed by evil forces. Lactantius said, quote, "The men themselves do not persecute, who do not have reason why they should be angry with the innocent. But those unclean, abandoned spirits to whom the truth is both known and unwanted, insinuate themselves into the minds and incite them unwitting to fury. These spirits flee in the name of the true God. At hearing this name, they tremble, cry out, and testify that they are branded and beaten." Now, Lactantius's ideas over exorcism as the possession of the human body by a malevolent force and the idea that you could remove this malevolent force from the human body carried on through the ages. This recurring theme was supported by other recurring ideas, one of which was the idea that disunity and disharmony amongst Christians provided a breeding ground for demonic incursions, such as possessions. To illustrate these continuities, I want to take us to the latter half of the 17th century, to the Valencian town of Torreblanca, a place where Friar Juan de Girona encountered the guardian of hell. Friar Juan was in Torreblanca for official duties. He was a man who acquired a reputation for banishing legions of demons alongside performing miracles such as curing blindness and deafness. Friar Juan had heard reports of a possessed woman, an espiritada. Now, normally a call for outside assistance would not be warranted. Local parishes, local friars, in most cases, handled local exorcisms. But this time they had failed. There was something about this possession in particular. The demon in charge of protecting and defending hell was, in Friar Juan's words, a limping devil. How exactly the guardian of hell got its nickname as the Limping Devil is lost to time. There are several different accounts, but according to one legend, my favorite, the demon's limp was a result of the fact that he was the first angel to rebel against God. As such, he was the first angel to be cast out of heaven and thrown down to the earth. The other rebels fell upon him, crushing his leg and giving him his limp. Yet, the name Limping Devil is a very strange name for the guardian of hell, because the Limping Devil was the fastest of all demons, and therefore one of the most dangerous of all demons. Fast enough to evade God's wrath and fast enough to free his brethren. His speed meant that he was able to be anywhere at any time. Yet demons were not the only ones who could evoke an aurora of fear in those around them. Exorcists, such as Friar Juan, also inspired trepidation in others. This is because exorcists were always on the lookout for the devil's accomplices, those normal-looking individuals who were secretly aligned with dark forces. You did not want to be accused of being bros with Satan. For those individuals who were unwilling to do what the friar wanted, Friar Juan was not above threatening to evoke the Holy Inquisition to force people around him to do his bidding. One example of Friar Juan's egregious abuse of power was when he demanded to be alone with a 9-year-old girl. Supposedly, according to him, she was the daughter of the witch responsible for the possessed woman that brought him to Torreblanca. At first, their family refused to let their child be alone with Friar Juan, but in the face of this reluctance, Friar Juan said, quote, "If the child did not come, the Inquisition would burn her." Yet, Friar Juan pressed forth with his mission. He rebaptized the possessed woman, hoping it would drive out the demonic forces, but this was not successful. He then ordered the demons to flee and leave at once, yet this was also not successful. The possessed woman kept complaining and kept acting as before the arrival of the friar. It was then that one villager, a physician, tired of Friar Juan's antics, confronted Friar Juan directly, saying, quote, "What is this, father? How is this woman again possessed?" To which Friar Juan retorted that she had all the demons of hell except one, who was lame, who had stayed behind to guard hell. Now I bring up the case of Friar Juan because in many ways the Spanish conquistadors were analogs to European exorcists. In the 16th century, conquistadors drove out the devil by imposing their colonial authority on the American hemisphere, on this supposedly demonic part of the world. The more that the Spanish could prove the existence and proliferation of Satan, the more support Spanish forces could acquire for their imperial project. Now, as we have seen in previous episodes, the Franciscans considered Hernán Cortés to be a general of Christ who opened a battlefront against the dark forces of Satan. The Franciscans saw Spanish colonization as a holy war, and part of this holy war entailed the exorcism of America, the exorcism of places that the Mexica people held sacred. Cortés ordered the great temple of the Aztecs to be destroyed. Now, before the arrival of the Spaniards, the Templo Mayor symbolized Aztec grandeur, Aztec imperial might. Additionally, it was the spiritual and religious center of the Aztec world. It is where the Aztecs conducted their numerous sacrifices to their gods, and this is why Cortés destroyed it. The destruction of the Great Temple represented a transfer of power from the Mexica to the Spanish, symbolized with the construction of a grand cathedral on the ruins of the Great Temple, to also symbolize the new reign of Catholicism and Spanish power. The construction of this grand cathedral over the ruins of a supposedly satanic place of worship represented a seal between a world of evil and a world of good. But throughout the 16th century, friars continued to destroy Mexica temples and places of pagan worship. And the scale of these exorcisms in the American hemisphere was unparalleled anywhere in Europe. The Spanish created a wide-scale regime of iconoclasm, destroying the religious symbols and sites of the Mexica people. Now, of course, we could get lost in the technicalities of whether or not the exorcism of places is the same as the exorcism of people. But this is irrelevant, because the authors who recorded the destruction of Mexica temples, they, in their own time period, considered this to be an exorcism. So that's how it looked like from their eyes. And that's how they portrayed it to other Spaniards. Moreover, unlike Europe, the Spanish engaged in such widespread destruction because of the differences between the culture of the indigenous Americans and the Europeans. In Europe, you had single cases of individuals seeking to destroy what the Spanish believed to be a fundamentally Christian society. So exorcisms for them represented cracks in a solid foundation. In contrast, the American hemisphere was dominated by Satan. And it was Christianity who was trying to find ways to penetrate this spiritual void. Indeed, let's look at the Aztec god, Quetzalcoatl, also known as the feathered serpent. The feathered serpent was a patron of the arts and a provider of human sustenance. And this was a deity that was practiced beyond the Mexica, and other cultures in the region also worshipped this very same god. And of course, the Spanish saw this from their religious background, from their subjective experience. And their cultural background told them that the snake was Satan. The snake is what tempted Eve and got the humans kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Thus, the Spanish could always point to the Aztec worship of Quetzalcoatl and be like, look, see, I told you, they're all a bunch of devil worshippers. Look, they're worshiping the snake. Mira, just look at them, come on. And of course, there were other elements of Aztec culture which reinforced this idea of the Mexica people basically being a people of devil worshippers. Catholics saw the Mexican ritual cannibalism as essentially a blasphemy of the Eucharist. The Eucharist being the Catholic pseudo-cannibalistic ritual of eating the body of Christ and drinking the blood of Christ. Maybe they just didn't like the cannibalistic competition, I don't know. The Spanish saw this practice and believed that the cannibalism of the Aztecs was a deliberate affront to the Catholic Eucharist, and that it could have only been inspired by demons. After all, only demons would know how to give the finger to God in this very particular way. At least that's what they believed. Now, this idea that Spain had conducted a large-scale exorcism was reflected in literature. As we saw in a previous episode, Hispania liberated America from Satan's grasp. But this was only one of many poems which reflected the idea that the Mexica people were a bunch of satanic worshippers. In fact, there was a genre of literature that one historian called the satanic epic. The contemporary of Juan Castellanos was a 16th century son of a conquistador, Francisco de Terrazas. Like Castellanos, Terrazas portrayed the Spanish conquest of America as a glorious achievement, sponsored by God and spreading immaculate Western civilization to a new people, etc., etc. Now, in the poem of Terrazas, there was a cannibal leader named Canetabo. Canetabo was represented as an evil ruler who sacrificed Spanish troops and offered their hearts to the dark gods. Terrazas portrayed Canetabo as an agent of Satan, ruling over a hellish realm. Terrazas described Canetabo as, quote, huge, fat, with hands drenched in blood and blackened with smoke, and a striped black-red face with a red mouth and teeth spilling blood. However, what I really want to emphasize here is the fact that Terrazas portrayed the Spanish conquest as an act of liberation. At one point, Terrazas wrote, quote, del poder de Satan te libertaron, which means, from the power of Satan, they liberated you. We will return to this point. This idea of liberation was also reinforced with the 16th century aristocrat, civil magistrate, historian, and poet, Antonio Guzman. He wrote a book which, like so many others, portrayed Satan as the ruler of the American hemisphere, ruling over his tyrannical, evil empire. Guzman wrote about how, from his evil empire, which heaven had banished, Satan could see the impending arrival of Spanish forces and trembled at the very sight of them. Like Terrazas, Guzman also used the word libertar. Now, the English words liberty and liberation, and the Spanish words libertar and libertaron all have their etymological origins in the Latin word libertas. Thus, the Spanish routinely portrayed themselves as liberators, liberating the Mexica people from the tyrannical grasp of Satan. In their eyes and in their words, the Spanish conquest was a war of liberation. The idea of the Spanish military intervention as a war of liberation put a positive little spin on the violence and bloodshed that came as a result of the Spanish conquest. Now, the idea of wars of liberation to justify imperial aims is something that resonates deeply in American culture, something that we could see in modern times. The Spanish Like those who followed in their footsteps basically said like, look, our use of the military is not for evil purposes. We are the good guys here. We are liberators here. But as we're going to see, this was not a direct A to B line. Moreover, the idea of the Spanish conquest as an act of liberation began a tradition of thinking on American soil. This was a discourse which characterized the Western Hemisphere as a land of liberty. That is a place where one can be free.